Most of what we think we know about the Bronze Age collapse is downstream of one or two sources, and those sources had reasons to lie. Let's pull on that thread. Sometime in the decades on either side of 1200 BC, the connected world of the Eastern Mediterranean stopped working. Mycenaean palaces burned. The Hittite capital was abandoned. Ugarit, a wealthy port on the Syrian coast, was sacked and never reoccupied. Egyptian inscriptions describe foreign coalitions arriving by sea and land, and a king who claims he beat them back. This isn't one civilization falling. It's roughly half a dozen, in something like the same human lifetime, across thousands of kilometers. The interesting question isn't who attacked whom. It's how a whole interlocking system can synchronize its own funeral, and why we still can't agree on the cause. The strongest evidence for the collapse is the dirt, not the documents. Across the Eastern Mediterranean, excavators have found a roughly contemporaneous horizon of destruction layers dating to the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. At Hadusa, the Hittite capital in central Anatolia, the citadel was abandoned and partially burned. On the Greek mainland, the major Mycenaean palatial centers, including Pylos, Mycenae, and Tiryns, show fire damage and were never rebuilt as functioning palaces. On the Syrian coast, Ugarit was destroyed by fire and never reoccupied as a city. Inland sites in the Levant and southeastern Anatolia show similar burn layers in roughly the same window. What we are looking at, in archaeological terms, is not one event but a cluster, and the cluster is tight enough that something connects them. The literacy that held the late Bronze Age together largely disappears too. The linear B script of the Mycenaean palaces vanishes with the palaces. Cuneiform administrative archives in the Levant thin dramatically. For roughly 2 to 3 centuries afterward in Greece and parts of the Levant, the written record is sparse to non-existent. Whatever happened, it took the bureaucracies down with it. The single most cited text for this period is carved on the walls of the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu near Luxor. The reliefs and accompanying inscriptions describe coalitions of foreign peoples, coming both overland through the Levant and by sea, whom the Egyptian record groups under names we now translate as the Peliset, the Tejeker, the Shekelesh, the Denian, the Weshesh, and others. Modern scholarship calls them collectively the Sea Peoples, although that umbrella label is itself a 19th century scholarly convenience. The inscription claims a sweeping Egyptian victory in roughly the 8th year of Ramesses III, conventionally placed in the early 12th century BC, around 1177 BC in one common chronology. That date is where Eric Klein got the title of his popular synthesis. But we should be careful. Medinet Habu is royal propaganda carved on a temple wall. It is designed to celebrate a pharaoh, not to file an honest after-action report. The named peoples are real enough as labels, but the inscription does not tell us where they came from, why they were moving, or whether they were a coordinated invasion or a symptom of something already underway elsewhere. It is one source, with one agenda, describing one battle. The most evocative documentary evidence comes from Ugarit itself. Among the cuneiform tablets recovered from the city are diplomatic letters describing enemy ships off the coast, requests for grain and military help sent to neighbors and overlords, and references to forces fighting far from home while the homeland was exposed. Some of these tablets appear to have been baked accidentally when the city burned, which is part of why we can still read them. The picture they sketch is of a small, wealthy port that knew it was in trouble and could not get help in time. There are also late Hittite letters, including correspondence concerning the kingdom of Ahiyawa, a polity many scholars associate with the Mycenaean Greek world, and references in Hittite records to a region around western Anatolia that had been a chronic source of conflict. None of these documents say, plainly, what was happening across the whole region. They are local cries from inside a system that was unraveling. That is actually the more useful framing. Instead of one grand narrative, we have a chorus of officials, each describing their own corner of a problem none of them could see whole. The view from inside a collapse rarely is the view of a collapse. Over the last 15 years or so, paleoclimate evidence has moved from the margins of this debate to its center. Pollen cores taken from sediments in the Sea of Galilee and from lake and lagoon deposits along the eastern Mediterranean coast suggest a shift toward drier conditions in the late 13th and 12th centuries BC. Oxygen and carbon isotope work from speleothems, the mineral deposits in caves, points in a similar direction. The signal is not uniform everywhere, and dating these proxies tightly to single decades is hard. But the broad picture is a sustained drying trend across parts of the region in the relevant window. That matters because late Bronze Age palace economies were grain economies. The Hittite heartland in central Anatolia depended on imported grain, much of it shipped from Egypt and the Levant. A few bad harvests in the wrong places year after year would have strained the trade routes that knit the system together. Climate doesn't burn cities by itself, but it is the kind of slow, structural pressure that makes everything else, raiders, famine refugees, rebellions, more likely. The climate case is strongest as a stressor, weakest as a sole cause. The other major causal candidates each have a constituency. The invasion theory in its older form treats the sea peoples as the engine of the collapse, a wave of migrants or raiders sweeping east and south. That reading takes the Medinet Habu inscription roughly at face value. The problem is that it explains coastal destruction better than inland destruction, and it leaves open who the sea peoples actually were and why they were moving. Some of them may themselves have been refugees from collapses already happening elsewhere. The earthquake storm hypothesis, associated with archaeologist Amos Nur and others, points out that the eastern Mediterranean sits on active fault systems and that clusters of large earthquakes can occur within a few decades. There is suggestive evidence of seismic damage at several sites, although distinguishing earthquake damage from siege damage in a burned palace is harder than it sounds. The system's collapse theory, most prominently associated with Eric Klein's synthesis, argues that the late Bronze Age was a tightly coupled international system: palaces, trade routes, diplomatic marriages, grain flows, and that tightly coupled systems fail catastrophically when stressed on multiple fronts at once. Each theory captures something. None alone captures all of it. Here is the read I find most defensible. The late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean was a small number of large states: the Egyptian New Kingdom, the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean Palace Network, the Kassite dynasty in Babylonia, Assyria, Ugarit, and the other Levantan kingdoms, plus Cyprus, locked into a dense web of trade, diplomacy, and military balance. Tin for bronze came from far away. Grain moved across the sea. Royal correspondence in standardized cuneiform tied the courts together. That kind of tightly coupled system has two properties that matter here. It is efficient in good conditions, and it amplifies shocks in bad ones. A bad harvest in Anatolia is not just an Anatolian problem. A pirate squadron in the eastern Mediterranean is not just a coastal problem. A peasant uprising in one palace's hinterland leaks into the next palace's labor supply. Once two or three of these pressures coincide, the same trade and political networks that made everyone rich become channels for failure. The system's framing has one honest weakness. It explains why a collapse once started would propagate. It is less good at explaining what specifically lit the match in any one location. We should not pretend otherwise. This is the part where, on this channel, we slow down. We do not know with any precision the sequence of the destructions. The dating resolution on most of these sites is decades at best, not years. We cannot confidently say Hadusa fell before Ugarit or Pylos before either. We do not know who the sea peoples actually were. The names in the Egyptian record are labels, not ethnographies, and attempts to map them onto later peoples. Philistines, Sicilians, others, are educated inferences, not settled facts. We do not know how much of the destruction at any given site was external attack versus internal revolt versus earthquake versus a fire that started in a kitchen and finished a palace. We do not know whether the climate signal is the cause, a contributing stressor, or partly an artifact of the proxies we happen to have. And we do not know what the people inside the collapse thought was happening to them. The written record largely stops at the moment we would most like to hear from it. Most of the strongest claims in popular accounts are extrapolations built on a fairly thin documentary base. That is worth keeping in mind every time someone tells you exactly what brought down the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age civilizations did not fall because of one thing. They fell because a tightly connected world ran into several pressures at once, and the connections that had made it prosperous became the routes by which failure traveled. We tell stories about single causes, sea peoples, drought, earthquakes, because single causes make better stories. Complex systems do not need a villain to fail. They need only to be stressed in more than one place at once. What survives is often what was useful to power, not what was true. If a piece of this story changed your mind or didn't, that's the point. I'm Marcus. Until next time.